In the shadowed corridors of 19th-century European royalty, where whispers of scandal could topple dynasties, one name echoed with a peculiar and scandalous notoriety: Ferdinand VII of Spain. His reign, marked by political upheaval and personal enigma, was shrouded in a mystery so intimate, so taboo, that it became the stuff of hushed gossip across the continent, a mystery tied to the most private aspect of his being, a rumor about his anatomy that fueled both ridicule and fascination. Welcome to the tumultuous world of early 1800s Spain, a nation battered by war, betrayal, and the iron grip of a king whose personal life was as controversial as his rule. This is not just a story of power and politics, but of a man whose very body became a subject of myth, a symbol of his perceived inadequacies, and a lens through which we glimpse the fragility of monarchy itself. To understand Ferdinand VII and the scandal that clung to him like a dark shadow, we must first step back into the fractured landscape of Spain at the dawn of the 19th century. Born on the 14th of October, 1784, Ferdinand was the eldest son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma. From the outset, his life was steeped in the opulence and intrigue of the Spanish Bourbon court, a world where loyalty was a rare commodity and betrayal a daily currency. Spain, at this time, was a fading empire, its once mighty influence waning under the weight of internal corruption and external threats. The late 18th century had seen the country struggle to maintain its grip on vast colonial territories while grappling with the revolutionary fervor sweeping through Europe, ignited by the French Revolution of 1789. The Spanish monarchy, long a bastion of absolute power, found itself increasingly at odds with Enlightenment ideals and the rising tide of liberalism, a tension that would define Ferdinand's life and reign. Ferdinand's early years were marked by a strained relationship with his parents, particularly his mother, Queen Maria Luisa, and her rumored lover, Manuel Godoy, the powerful prime minister. Godoy, a man of humble origins who rose to dizzying heights through royal favor, was despised by many, including Ferdinand himself, who saw him as a usurper of royal authority. By the early 1800s, Ferdinand, then Prince of Asturias, became a figurehead for those who opposed Godoy's influence, positioning himself as a champion of traditional Spanish values against the perceived corruption of his parents' court. This familial discord set the stage for a dramatic power struggle, one that would soon be overshadowed by an even greater crisis: the Napoleonic invasion of Spain. In 1808, under the pretext of alliance, Napoleon Bonaparte forced Charles IV to abdicate, placing his own brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. Ferdinand, briefly king before his forced abdication, was imprisoned in France, becoming a symbol of Spanish resistance during the Peninsular War, conflict that would ravage the nation and leave an indelible mark on his legacy. Yet, amidst these grand historical currents, it was not just Ferdinand's political missteps or his role in Spain's turbulent history that captured the imagination of his contemporaries. Behind closed doors, in the salons of Madrid and the courts of Europe, another narrative emerged on far more personal and scandalous. Rumors began to circulate about Ferdinand's physical condition, specifically about an alleged abnormality in his private anatomy. This was no mere gossip. In an era where a monarch's virility was tied to the strength of the dynasty, such whispers carried profound implications. The king's body was not just his own, it was a symbol of the state, and any perceived defect could be weaponized by enemies or used to undermine his authority. Historical accounts, though often veiled in euphemism, suggest that Ferdinand suffered from a condition known as macroorchidism, an enlargement of the testicles, which may have been linked to broader health issues or even infertility. While medical knowledge of the time was limited, the rumor mill was not, and this supposed defect became a source of mockery, a cruel jest that painted Ferdinand as less than a man, unfit to rule or to sire a lasting heir. These whispers were compounded by Ferdinand's tumultuous personal life. Married 4 times, his unions were plagued by tragedy, political maneuvering, and a conspicuous lack of surviving heirs, until late in his reign. His first marriage to Maria Antonia of Naples ended in her death after multiple miscarriages. His second, to Maria Isabel of Portugal, produced a daughter who died in infancy. His third, to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, bore no children at all. It was only with his 4th wife, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, that he finally secured the succession with the birth of Isabella II in 1830. Yet, each failed marriage fueled the gossip, with courtiers and commoners alike speculating that the king's rumored condition was to blame. In a society obsessed with lineage and masculinity, Ferdinand's private struggles became public fodder, a lens through which his political failures were magnified. How could a king who could not secure his own dynasty hope to secure a nation? As we delve deeper into Ferdinand VII's story, we must navigate the intersection of fact and myth, separating historical truth from the salacious tales spun by his detractors. This is not merely a story of a man's body, but of how that body became a battleground for power, perception, and prejudice in a Spain teetering on the edge of modernity. In the parts to come, we will explore how these personal controversies intertwined with his disastrous reign, marked by the restoration of absolutism, the loss of Spain's American colonies, and a legacy of division that haunts the nation to this day. But for now, let us linger in the early shadows of his life, where a prince, soon to be king, stood at the crossroads of destiny, unaware that even his most intimate secrets would become the stuff of legend. As Ferdinand VII emerged from the gilded cage of his youth into the harsh light of kingship, the weight of a fractured Spain pressed down upon him with unrelenting force. The year was 1808, and the Iberian Peninsula was a battleground, caught in the iron jaws of Napoleonic ambition. Ferdinand, briefly crowned king after a palace coup forced his father, Charles IV, to abdicate, found himself at the center of a storm he could neither control nor escape. His reign, barely begun, was snatched away when Napoleon, under the guise of mediation, lured him to Bayonne, France, and coerced both father and son to renounce the Spanish throne. Imprisoned in the Château de Valençay, Ferdinand became a pawn in a grander game, while his country bled under French occupation. Yet, even as Spain rallied against the invader in the brutal Peninsular War, whispers of Ferdinand's personal inadequacies, those scandalous rumors about his private anatomy, began to weave themselves into the broader tapestry of discontent, casting doubt on his fitness to lead a nation in crisis. The Spanish people, desperate for a symbol of resistance, clung to the image of their absent king, dubbing him El Deseado, the Desired One. Guerrilla fighters and regular armies alike fought in his name, their cries echoing through the ravaged countryside as they battled Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's imposed ruler. But Ferdinand, confined in luxury yet powerless, could do little more than wait. His imprisonment, lasting from 1808 to 1814, was not just a physical captivity but a crucible for the growing tensions that would define his rule. In his absence, Spain was governed by a patchwork of juntas and a liberal constitution drafted in 1812 by the Cortes of Cadiz document that sought to limit royal power and enshrine modern reforms. This constitution, born of necessity and revolutionary zeal, stood in stark opposition to the absolutist traditions Ferdinand had been raised to uphold. The stage was set for a clash not just of armies, but of ideologies, with Ferdinand at its heart, a man whose personal controversies would soon mirror the nation's own divisions. While Ferdinand languished in France, the rumors about his physical condition festered, fed by a potent mix of political enmity and cultural obsession with royal virility. In an era where a king's ability to produce heirs was seen as a divine mandate, any hint of incapacity was a weapon in the hands of his detractors. The gossip, though often exaggerated or unfounded, pointed to a supposed abnormality, possibly macroorchidism or related health issues, that was said to affect his reproductive capabilities. These tales, whispered in the courts of Europe and scrawled in anonymous pamphlets, painted Ferdinand as a flawed man, unworthy of the crown. His enemies, both foreign and domestic, seized upon this narrative, using it to undermine his legitimacy even as he remained a symbol of Spanish resistance. The personal became political, and the political became personal, in a vicious cycle that would haunt Ferdinand for the rest of his life. Compounding these whispers were the early failures of his personal life, which seemed to lend credence to the cruel gossip. His first marriage to Maria Antonia of Naples, arranged in 1802 when he was just 18, was meant to secure a strong alliance and produce heirs to solidify the Bourbon line. But the union was marred by tragedy. Maria Antonia suffered multiple miscarriages before dying of tuberculosis in 1806, leaving Ferdinand childless and vulnerable to speculation. The court, ever hungry for scandal, murmured that the fault lay with the prince, not the princess, and the seeds of doubt about his manhood took deeper root. In a society where masculinity and monarchy were inextricably linked, each personal loss was a public blow, eroding the mystique of divine kingship that Ferdinand so desperately needed to maintain. The pressure to remarry and prove his detractors wrong became a relentless undercurrent, even as he sat powerless in French captivity. Meanwhile, the war in Spain raged on, a brutal conflict that saw atrocities on both sides and left the nation scarred. The Spanish, aided by British forces under the Duke of Wellington, slowly pushed back the French, reclaiming their land city by city, village by village. By 1813, Napoleon's grip on Spain was slipping, and with his empire crumbling under the weight of multiple fronts, he agreed to release Ferdinand under the Treaty of Valenciennes. The king's return in March 1814 was met with jubilation. Crowds lined the streets, hailing their long-lost monarch as a savior. But beneath the cheers lay a simmering unease. The liberal factions who had fought for Spain's freedom under the 1812 Constitution expected Ferdinand to embrace reform, to share power with the people who had bled for him. The absolutists, on the other hand, yearned for a return to the old order, where the king's word was law and the church reigned supreme. Ferdinand, shaped by a lifetime of privilege and betrayal, stood at a crossroads, his personal insecurities and the weight of scandal coloring every decision he would make. As he retook the throne, the conflict within Spain mirrored the conflict within Ferdinand himself. Could a man so maligned, so burdened by rumor and personal tragedy, unite a nation torn apart by war and ideology? The whispers about his body, once mere court gossip, now carried the weight of prophecy. Could a king perceived as broken in flesh truly mend a broken kingdom? The rising tension between Ferdinand's desire for absolute control and the liberal aspirations of his people would soon erupt into open conflict, while his personal life continued to fuel the fires of ridicule and doubt. In the coming years, his reign would become a battleground, not just for power, but for the very soul of Spain, with every misstep magnified by the shadow of that most intimate controversy. With Ferdinand VII's return to Madrid in the spring of 1814, Spain held its breath, hoping for a rebirth after the devastation of the Peninsular War. The streets swelled with fervent crowds, their cheers a desperate plea for stability, for a king who would heal the wounds of occupation and division. Yet, beneath the surface of this triumphant homecoming, a darker reality festered. Ferdinand, now 29 years old, carried not just the expectations of a battered nation but the weight of personal demands. Rumors about his physical condition that had grown into a pervasive shadow over his legitimacy. His imprisonment in France had been a physical confinement, but the true cage was the unrelenting scrutiny of his private life, a torment that would only intensify as he grappled with a kingdom on the brink of collapse. This was no mere political decline. It was a deeply personal one, where every failure, public or intimate, became a lash against his already fragile sense of self. Ferdinand's first act upon reclaiming the throne was a brutal rejection of the very ideals that had sustained Spain in his absence. The 1812 Constitution, crafted by the Cortes of Cádiz, had been a beacon of liberal hope, promising a constitutional monarchy, individual rights, and a break from the absolutist past. But Ferdinand, molded by a lifetime of royal entitlement and embittered by years of powerlessness, saw it as a betrayal of his divine right to rule. On May 4, 1814, with the stroke of a pen and the backing of conservative nobles and clergy, he abolished the Constitution, declaring it null and void. The liberal dream was crushed underfoot as he restored absolute monarchy, unleashing a wave of repression against those who had dared to envision a different Spain. Political opponents were arrested, press freedoms curtailed, and the Inquisition, abolished under French rule, was reinstated to root out dissent. This was Ferdinand's Spain now, a realm where his word was law, but also a realm where his personal controversies made every decree a target for whispered mockery. The king's personal life, already a source of scandal, became an even greater burden in the harsh light of his restored power. The rumors about his anatomy, speculations of a physical abnormality that impaired his ability to produce heir, no longer just idle gossip, but a political liability. In a monarchy obsessed with succession, Ferdinand's inability to secure a lasting heir was a gaping wound in his authority. His second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Portugal in 1816, was meant to silence the doubters. She was young, fertile, and tied to a powerful neighboring dynasty, a perfect match to bolster his image. Yet, tragedy struck again. Maria Isabel bore a daughter in 1817, but the child died within months, and a second pregnancy ended in the Queen's death in 1818 during childbirth, along with the infant. The court mourned publicly, but privately, the whispers grew louder. Was the king cursed? Or was the fault, as many dared to suggest, rooted in his rumored condition? Each loss was a public humiliation, a reminder of the intimate mystery that clung to Ferdinand like a second skin, eroding the myth of an invincible monarch. This personal torment was mirrored by the decline of Spain itself under Ferdinand's iron-fisted rule. His rejection of liberal reforms alienated vast swathes of the population, including the very soldiers and citizens who had fought for his return. Economic hardship gripped the nation. War had drained the treasury, and the loss of trade with Spain's American colonies, now stirring with revolutionary fervor, compounded the crisis. Ferdinand's refusal to adapt, to embrace any form of modernization, turned potential allies into enemies. By 1820, the simmering discontent boiled over. A military uprising led by liberal officers, including Rafael del Riego, forced Ferdinand to reinstate the 1812 Constitution, ushering in the Triennio Liberale, a 3-year period of constitutional rule. For a king who had tasted absolute power, this was a bitter pill, a public emasculation that echoed the private humiliations he endured. Confined to a ceremonial role, Ferdinand seethed, plotting his return to dominance while the nation teetered between reform and reaction. The decline was not just political, it was personal, as every setback seemed to confirm the cruel jests about his body and his worth as a man. Amidst this chaos, Ferdinand's third marriage in 1819 to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony offered a fleeting hope for stability. She was a pious, reserved woman, a stark contrast to the political maelstrom around them. Yet this union too bore no fruit. Childless after years of marriage, the couple's inability to produce an heir further fueled the gossip that had haunted Ferdinand for decades. Courtiers and commoners alike speculated openly now, their words a constant reminder of his perceived inadequacy. Historical accounts from the period, though often veiled in decorum, hint at Ferdinand's growing isolation, his frustration manifesting in bursts of temper and paranoia. He was a king, imprisoned not by walls, as he had been in France, but by the unrelenting judgment of his own people, a judgment that cut deeper than any sword, targeting the most intimate part of his identity. The decline of Ferdinand VII's reign in these years was a slow, torturous unraveling, both for the man and the monarchy he embodied. Spain, once a mighty empire, was slipping through his fingers, with colonies in Latin America declaring independence one by one. Mexico in 1821, Peru by 1824, each loss a blow to his prestige. At home, the liberal experiment of the Triennio Liberal was fragile, opposed by absolutist factions loyal to Ferdinand's vision of unchecked power. And through it all, the specter of his personal scandal loomed large, a cruel undercurrent to every political failure. How could a king, mocked for his very manhood, hope to hold together a disintegrating empire? The torment of Ferdinand VII was not just in the rebellions or the empty treasury, but in the mirror he faced each day, where the weight of rumor and reality merged into a single, unbearable burden. By the early 1820s, Ferdinand VII of Spain stood at the precipice of a personal and political abyss, his reign a tempest of betrayal, loss, and unrelenting scrutiny. The Triennio Liberal, forced upon him by the 1820 uprising, had stripped him of absolute power, confining him to a ceremonial role under the reinstated 1812 Constitution. Yet, even as liberal reforms reshaped Spain, the king's heart burned with resentment, his mind plotting a return to the unbridled authority he believed was his divine right. Meanwhile, the whispers about his private anatomy, those cruel rumors of a physical abnormality, had grown into a deafening chorus, a constant reminder of his perceived inadequacy as both man and monarch. This was the moment of climax, where the weight of personal shame and political failure collided, driving Ferdinand into a corner from which there was no easy escape. His story, already steeped in tragedy, was about to reach its most harrowing peak, not in a single dramatic death, but in a slow, grinding demise of spirit and legacy. The turning point came in 1823, when the fragile liberal experiment of the triennio collapsed under the weight of internal division and external intervention. Ferdinand, ever the opportunist, despite his personal torments, had secretly appealed to the Holy Alliancia coalition of conservative European powers led by France, Austria, and Russia for aid to restore his absolute rule. In April of that year, a French army under the Duke of Angoulême crossed the Pyrenees, marching into Spain with the blessing of the alliance to crush the liberal government. The invasion, known as the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, was swift and brutal. By October, Madrid fell, and Ferdinand was once again the unchallenged master of Spain. But this victory was a hollow one, stained by the blood of his own people and the bitter taste of foreign dependency. The king, hailed as a savior by absolutists, was reviled by liberals as a traitor who had invited foreign boots onto Spanish soil to reclaim his crown. The triumph of power could not erase the personal humiliation that clung to him, nor could it silence the gossip about his body that had become as much a part of his identity as the crown itself. With absolutism restored, Ferdinand unleashed a wave of vengeance that would define the latter part of his reign, a period known as the ominous decade, from 1823 to 1833. Political opponents were hunted down with ruthless efficiency. Thousands of liberals were imprisoned, exiled, or executed as the king sought to erase any trace of constitutionalism. The Inquisition, already a specter of fear, was wielded with renewed vigor to suppress dissent and enforce orthodoxy. Spain became a land of silence and suspicion, where even a whispered word against the king could mean a death sentence. Yet, for all his outward ferocity, Ferdinand's inner world was crumbling. The personal tragedies of his marriages continued to haunt him, each childless union or lost infant, a public wound that fueled the cruel jests about his supposed condition. Historical accounts suggest that the king, now in his late 30s and early 40s, grew increasingly withdrawn, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation, as if to mask the vulnerability he could not escape. The climax of his reign was not a moment of glory, but a descent into paranoia and isolation, where every victory was tainted by the shadow of his intimate shame. The most poignant blow came in the form of his ongoing struggle to secure the succession, a battle that seemed to embody the very rumors that plagued him. After the death of his third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia, in 1829 with no heirs to show for their decade-long marriage, Ferdinand married for the fourth time to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, a woman nearly 20 years his junior. This union, forged in 1829, was a desperate bid for a lasting legacy. In 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, who would later become Isabella II, and in 1832, a second daughter, Luisa Fernanda, arrived. For the first time, Ferdinand had living heirs, a triumph that should have silenced his detractors. Yet, even this victory was marred by controversy. Under traditional Spanish Salic law, only male heirs could inherit the throne, and Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos stood as the next in line. To secure Isabella's future, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, overturning the Salic law to allow female succession, a move that enraged absolutist factions and sowed the seeds of the Carlist Wars that would erupt after his death. Even in his moment of personal triumph, Ferdinand could not escape conflict, nor could he fully dispel the whispers that his long struggle for heirs was proof of his rumored physical flaw. As the 1830s dawned, Ferdinand's health began to falter, a physical decline that mirrored the decay of his reign. Years of stress, personal loss, and political turmoil took their toll, and by 1833, he was a shadow of the man who had once returned to Madrid in triumph. Historical records note that he suffered from gout and other ailments, his body weakening as if to reflect the broken state of his kingdom. On the 29th of September, 1833, Ferdinand VII died at the age of 48 in the royal palace of Madrid, his passing marked not by the grandeur befitting a king, but by a quiet, almost pitiful end. There was no cinematic battle or dramatic assassination. His demise was a slow unraveling, a life extinguished by the cumulative weight of personal torment and political failure. The man whose private life had been a source of endless speculation left behind a nation on the brink of civil war, a daughter whose claim to the throne would be contested, and a legacy stained by both his actions and the rumors that had defined him. In death, as in life, Ferdinand could not escape the mystery of his most intimate controversy, a shadow that lingered over his final breath. The death of Ferdinand VII on the 29th of September 1833 did not mark the end of his story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter of chaos and division for Spain. As the king's body was laid to rest in the royal crypt of the monastery of El Escorial, the nation he left behind stood on the edge of a precipice, teetering between old traditions and an uncertain future. His passing at the age of 48, after a reign marked by personal scandal and political repression, unleashed forces that had been simmering for decades. The whispers about his private anatomy, those persistent rumors of a physical abnormality, did not die with him. They lingered as a cruel footnote to a legacy already steeped in controversy. In the aftermath of his rule, Spain would grapple with the consequences of his decisions, both personal and political, while the mystery of his intimate life continued to color how history remembered him. This was not just the end of a king, but the birth of a fractured inheritance that would shape the nation for generations. The most immediate consequence of Ferdinand's death was the question of succession, a matter complicated by his late-life decision to alter centuries-old tradition. His daughter, Isabella, just 3 years old at the time of his passing, was declared queen under the pragmatic sanction of 1830, which allowed female succession. Her mother, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, assumed the role of regent, tasked with guiding the young queen through a turbulent political landscape. But this move was far from universally accepted. Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, claimed the throne for himself, arguing that the Salic law, which barred women from ruling, should stand. Supported by absolutist factions, the church and rural conservatives who revered the old order Ferdinand had championed, Don Carlos ignited the First Carlist War, a brutal civil conflict that raged from 1833 to 1840. The war tore Spain apart, pitting brother against niece, tradition against reform, and leaving tens of thousands dead in its wake. Ferdinand's decision to secure his daughter's future, born out of a desperate need for a lasting heir amid personal rumors of inadequacy, had instead sown the seeds of bloodshed, ensuring that his death would not bring peace but prolong the agony of his reign. Beyond the battlefield, Ferdinand's legacy was one of profound loss for Spain on a global scale. During his rule, the once mighty Spanish Empire had crumbled, with nearly all of its American colonies achieving independence by the time of his death. From Mexico to Argentina, nations broke free, inspired by the same liberal ideals Ferdinand had so fiercely opposed. His refusal to adapt, to negotiate, or to embrace reform had accelerated this disintegration, reducing Spain to a shadow of its former glory. Economically, the nation was crippled. Decades of war, internal strife, and colonial loss left the treasury empty and the people impoverished. Politically, his restoration of absolutism and brutal suppression during the ominous decade had deepened divisions, creating a rift between liberals and conservatives that would define Spanish politics for the rest of the 19th century. Ferdinand's reign, often remembered as a disastrous return to the past, became a cautionary tale of what happens when a ruler clings to outdated power at the expense of progress, a legacy made all the more poignant by the personal scandals that undermined his authority at every turn. The rumors about Ferdinand's private life, specifically the speculation surrounding his anatomy and supposed inability to produce heirs until late in life, did not fade into obscurity with his death. Instead, they became a part of the historical narrative, a lens through which his failures were often viewed. While modern historians debate the veracity of these claims, some suggesting a condition like macroorchidism or related health issues, others dismissing them as politically motivated slander, the impact of the gossip is undeniable. In an era where a monarch's virility was tied to the strength of the state, such rumors weakened Ferdinand's image giving his enemies a weapon to wield against him even posthumously. Contemporary accounts and later writings often mention these whispers with a mix of derision and pity, painting Ferdinand as a tragic figure, a king whose personal vulnerabilities were as much a burden as the crown itself. This intimate controversy, whether rooted in fact or fiction, ensured that his name would be remembered not just for political missteps, but for a deeply human flaw that history refused to forget. In the years following his death, Spain struggled to reconcile the memory of Ferdinand VII with the reality of his impact. To absolutists and traditionalists, he remained a defender of the old order, a king who fought to preserve the divine right of monarchy against the tide of liberalism. To reformers and liberals, he was a tyrant, a man whose paranoia and repression set Spain back decades at a time when Europe was marching toward modernity. His personal life, with its string of tragic marriages and the lingering mystery of his physical condition, added a layer of pathos to this polarized view, making him a figure of both scorn and reluctant sympathy. Over time, as the Carlist Wars gave way to further instability and Isabella II's own troubled reign unfolded, Ferdinand's story was often overshadowed by the larger struggles of the nation he had ruled. Yet, in quiet corners of historical discourse, the scandal of his private part endured, a reminder of how even the most powerful are not immune to the cruelty of rumor and the weight of personal shame. As the dust of Ferdinand VII's tumultuous reign settled over a Spain scarred by war, division, and loss, the echoes of his life continued to reverberate through the annals of history. His death in 1833 marked not an end, but a haunting continuation of the struggles he had both endured and inflicted. A king whose personal mysteries, particularly the scandalous rumors about his private anatomy, became as infamous as his political failures, Ferdinand remains a figure of profound contradiction. He was a monarch who clung to absolute power in an age of revolution, a man whose intimate vulnerabilities were weaponized against him, and a ruler whose legacy is as much about what was whispered behind closed doors as what was decreed from the throne. Now, as we step back from the intricate tapestry of his story, we are left to ponder the deeper truths beneath the scandal and strife, to reflect on what Ferdinand VII's life reveals about the fragility of power, the cruelty of perception, and the enduring weight of personal shame in the public eye. Ferdinand's reign, spanning nearly 2 decades of upheaval from 1814 to 1833, with a brief interlude in 1808, stands as a stark reminder of the perils of resisting change in a world that demands it. His stubborn restoration of absolutism, his brutal suppression of liberal ideals, and his role in the disintegration of the Spanish Empire paint a portrait of a king out of step with his time. Yet, it is impossible to separate these failures from the personal narrative that shadowed him, the persistent gossip about his physical condition, speculated by some to be a medical abnormality, that cast doubt on his masculinity and, by extension, his right to rule. In an era where a monarch's body was seen as a symbol of the state, Ferdinand's rumored inadequacy became a metaphor for Spain's own decline, a cruel parallel that amplified every misstep. Was he truly afflicted as the whispers claimed, or was this merely a fabrication of enemies eager to undermine him? The truth, obscured by the fog of history and the reticence of contemporary accounts, matters less than the impact those rumors shaped how he was perceived, how he governed, and how he is remembered. They remind us that even the mightiest are not immune to the human frailties that gossip can exploit, turning private pain into public spectacle. Looking beyond the scandal, Ferdinand's story also forces us to confront the broader consequences of his rule for Spain and its people. The Carlist Wars, sparked by his decision to secure the throne for his daughter Isabella, plunged the nation into decades of civil strife, a conflict rooted in the ideological battles he had inflamed. The loss of nearly all Spanish colonies in the Americas during his reign marked the end of an imperial era, leaving Spain to grapple with its diminished status on the world stage. Economically and socially, his policies of repression and refusal to modernize entrenched divisions that would haunt the country well into the 20th century. Yet, amidst this bleak legacy, there is a flicker of humanity in Ferdinand's personal tragedies: 4 marriages marked by loss, the desperate struggle for an heir, the weight of public judgment on his most intimate self. These elements invite a reluctant empathy, a recognition that behind the crown was a man burdened by expectations he could never fully meet, tormented by rumors he could never fully silence. His life, in all its complexity, challenges us to consider how history judges not just actions, but the personal vulnerabilities that shape them. What lingers most, perhaps, is the question of how much of Ferdinand VII's story was shaped by the mystery at its heart, the controversy over his private part that became a symbol of his perceived weakness. In a different time, under different circumstances, might such a personal detail have been overlooked, or at least confined to the shadows? Or was it inevitable that in the cutthroat world of 19th century monarchy, every flaw, real or imagined, would be magnified into a weapon? This enigma, more than any decree or battle, ensures that Ferdinand remains a figure of fascination, a king whose name evokes not just political turmoil, but a deeply human struggle against the cruelty of rumor. His reign asks us to reflect on the intersection of the personal and the political, on how the most private aspects of a life can become the loudest echoes in history's judgment. What does it mean to lead when the very essence of one's being is questioned, when the body itself becomes a battleground for legitimacy and scorn? As we close this chapter on Ferdinand VII, the man and the monarch, let us carry forward these questions, allowing them to linger as a reminder of history's complexity. His story is not just a tale of a king with a controversial secret, but a mirror to our own fascination with the flaws of those who rule. If this narrative has stirred something in you, be it curiosity, empathy, or debate, I invite you to share your thoughts. What do you make of Ferdinand's legacy, of the whispers that defined him as much as his crown? How do personal scandals shape our understanding of historical figures, and should they? Drop your reflections or questions below, and let's keep this conversation alive, peeling back the layers of a past that still speaks to us today.